What if a single act of kindness could thaw the iciest heart in the tallest tower? He only came to clean floors. But what happened next would quietly transform an entire company, and maybe even heal 2 lives along the way. Before we dive into this uplifting tale of quiet strength, second chances, and the power of simply showing up, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional, real-life stories every week. Single father Alex Carter never imagined he'd set foot in a building so polished, so imposing, so cold. As the glass doors of Meridian Tower slid open, fluorescent light spilled onto the sidewalk like a sterile promise. He took a breath, hoisted his small duffel bag, and stepped inside, boots scuffed, jeans faded, but posture straight. The lobby smelled like glass cleaner and ambition. Marble floors, towering pillars, and a massive silver MT logo hung above the reception desk like a judge's gavel. The night receptionist didn't look up. Janitorial team uses the service elevator. Alex nodded politely and headed down the hall she indicated. The man he'd interviewed with last week hadn't shared much. Just night shifts, basic cleaning, decent pay, no benefits. That was fine. Alex wasn't here for a career move. He was here for Sophie. Always Sophie. Upstairs, the office floors were silent. Computer monitors glowed blue in the dark. Cubicles sat empty, little graves of daily stress. Only the cleaning carts and silent figures in gray uniforms moved. Alex found his locker, pulled on his janitor's shirt, and got to work. By 9:30 p.m., he cleaned 2 floors, restocked the supply closet, and was heading for the 34th floor executive suite. He just emptied a trash bin when he heard it. A faint sound. Someone crying. Alex paused. Through the frosted glass of conference room C, he saw a hunched figure at the table, a young man, barely out of college, hands over his face, paper scattered everywhere, a shattered coffee mug at the edge. Alex hesitated. This wasn't his business. He was just a janitor. But then Sophie's voice echoed in his mind. "Daddy, you said if someone looks lost, we help, even if they don't ask." He tapped lightly on the glass. The young man flinched, then looked up, embarrassed. "Hey," Alex said gently, opening the door just a crack. "You all right?" The kid wiped his nose. "Yeah, I screwed up, that's all." Alex stepped in slowly. "Looks like a rough night." The young man gave a broken laugh. "I'm supposed to present this deck to the senior partners tomorrow. Spent 3 weeks on it. The formatting's off, the numbers don't add up, and my supervisor basically told me I might have blown my shot at a full-time position." Alex glanced at the open laptop. He didn't know much about finance, but he could tell the kid was drowning in stress and jargon. "Mind if I?" He gestured to the deck. The kid looked startled, then nodded. Alex sat down, scanned a few slides, and noticed some small mistakes, misaligned graphs, poor contrast, a date error on slide 7. "Most of it's fine," Alex said. "Just needs a little cleanup. You got the numbers in your notes." The intern blinked. "Yeah, but..." "Okay." Alex smiled. "I'll help you clean this up. I'm better with grease and engines, but I've had to fix a few presentations in my day." Together, they worked quietly for 15 minutes. Alex fixed the formatting, while the kid recalculated the totals. The tension in the room eased. The intern started to breathe again. When they finished, Alex stood, erased the whiteboard, wiped crumbs from the table, and picked up the broken mug. Before he left, he pulled a sticky note from his pocket, scribbled something, and stuck it to the edge of the monitor. "Don't forget this," he said quietly, then slipped out. Back in the hallway, Alex exhaled slowly. His break was over. Meanwhile, upstairs, CEO Evelyn Drake hated mornings, but she hated incompetence more. By 6:45 a.m., she was in the same conference room, skimming through the intern presentations her assistant had printed. Her fingers paused on one. The formatting was crisp, the data tracked, the projection solid. She frowned. Yesterday, the same report had been a mess. She remembered scolding the intern in front of half the floor. Her eyes narrowed. Then she saw it, a yellow sticky note left on the monitor. "You're not your mistakes. Try again. A no title, no logo, just that." Evelyn stared at it. She pressed the intercom. "Get me surveillance from last night." I want to know who accessed conference room C between 9 and midnight. Her assistant paused. Any specific reason? No, Evelyn replied evenly. Just curious. Meanwhile, Alex stepped out of the service elevator onto the ground floor just as Sophie came through the doors, library book and paper bag in hand. Hi, Daddy, she said, hopping into his arms. Hey, Button, he whispered, kissing her forehead. Ready for pancake morning? She nodded, grinning. He took her hand, and as they walked into the sunlight, neither noticed a woman watching from the executive window. Coffee forgotten, sticky note still in her hand. The janitor, the girl. Evelyn didn't know why, but something inside her stirred. Something warm, something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. She folded the note and slipped it into her coat pocket. For the first time in months, she smiled. When the topic of contracted services came up, the operations manager, Mr. Breener, barely hid his impatience. They're just floor people, he said, waving off the conversation. Replaceable. We can get faster, cheaper janitorial companies. Evelyn Shaw, CEO of Shaw Financial, arched her brows slightly. I reviewed the roster this morning, she said, flipping through her tablet. It seems you requested cuts to night staff. Yes, Breener replied. Low visibility, little ROI. What's the name of the janitor on the 34th floor last night? Breener blinked. Ma'am. She looked up, unblinking. The 34th floor. Janitor. Name. I believe that's Daniel Mercer. Was he part of your cost-cutting plan? Breener shifted in his seat. Well, yes. Evelyn's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Reverse it. Effective immediately. Breener looked stunned. May I ask why? Evelyn's gaze was cold steel. You may not. She dismissed the meeting, stood, and returned to her office. She didn't offer an explanation. She never did. But for the first time, her next action wasn't to pull up stock charts or capital reports. Instead, she opened a browser and typed, Daniel Mercer, Engineering Career History. It took less than 2 minutes to find an article from 7 years ago. Local engineer awarded U.S. patent for heat-efficient engine mod. Praise for innovative design and application. Daniel Mercer of Altus Automotive credited as design lead. And then, nothing. He'd vanished. Evelyn leaned back, fingers steepled. This was no ordinary janitor. That evening, Dan returned for his second shift as usual, shirt pressed, hair combed. His daughter Lily was reading in the lobby, her backpack at her feet. He'd barely finished dusting the main conference table when the intercom buzzed in his ear. Mr. Mercer, came the smooth voice from the front desk. Miss Shaw would like to see you in her office. Dan paused. Me? Yes, sir. He didn't know what to expect, but he'd faced enough hard turns in life not to flinch. He knocked twice before stepping in. Evelyn was behind her desk, reading a folder. She didn't look up. I wanted to thank you, she said, for what you did last night. Dan stood still. I didn't do anything out of line. Just helped someone who looked like he needed it. That's exactly what was out of line, she replied. Around here, people tend not to do that. A pause stretched between them. Finally, she looked up. I reviewed your file. It's vague. I didn't expect the CEO to go through it, Dan said, offering a soft smile. Evelyn didn't smile back, but her tone softened a breath. I value initiative, discretion, competence. You seem to have all three, but I'm not used to kindness being part of the package. Dan shrugged. I don't think the world needs more people pretending kindness is a liability. That made Evelyn's lips tighten. Something almost like a smirk trying to happen. I won't keep you, she said. Just keep doing what you're doing. Dan nodded, turning to go. Oh, she added. Tell your daughter I liked her book choice. I read that one when I was 10. Dan stopped, surprised. I'll let her know. He left quietly, but Evelyn didn't return to her reports. She looked instead out the tall glass window down toward the lobby, where the little girl was waiting. And this time, the Ice Queen wondered what it might feel like to be warm again. It was just past 9 p.m. when Dan Mercer caught the sound again. The quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the soft clatter of keyboard keys echoing from forgotten desks, and the whisperer's own footsteps moving from room to room like a ghost no one paid to see. That was the nature of the night shift. You existed in the in-between, between closing and opening, between silence and noise, between the lives people presented by day and the ones they try to hide at night. Dan didn't mind. In some ways, he preferred it. The quiet gave him space to think, to breathe, and most importantly, to make it back home, or at least a Lily, before the world started spinning again. He moved through the 28th floor with a practiced rhythm. Empty bins, wiped desks, restocked tissues, sweep. Each task done with care, never rushed, as if the job were not a job at all, but a duty. That was something his late wife used to say. How you do the small things is how you honor the big ones. Dan had taken that to heart. On the 31st floor, a young woman leaned against a vending machine, rubbing her ankle and blinking back tears. Her badge read M. Velasquez, Legal Department. Dan approached slowly. Miss, everything all right? She looked startled, quickly lowering her pant leg. It's nothing. I just twisted it on the escalator. Didn't want to cause a fuss. Dan nodded, crouched slightly to see her better. Can I take a look? She hesitated, but then sat on a bench nearby. Dan gently adjusted her ankle, checking the swelling. It's mild, he said, but you should elevate and ice it when you get home. I'll be here until 2. Brief deadline. Dan opened a supply cart and pulled out a cold pack from a mini freezer, something he brought on his own for nights just like this. He wrapped in a clean towel and handed it to her. 15 minutes on, 15 off. You'll thank me tomorrow. She looked at him, stunned. You're not supposed to. I mean, this isn't your job. Dan smiled. Helping isn't a job. It's just who we decide to be. He didn't wait for thanks. He nodded once and returned his cart. Elsewhere in the building, his small kindnesses continued. He replaced a broken keyboard on the 23rd floor, even though it had been marked awaiting service for 2 weeks. He refilled the coffee supply in the wellness room, even though that wasn't listed on his floor plan. He changed the fluorescent light in the hallway that buzzed slightly off pitch, something no one noticed during the day, but could drive a night worker quietly mad by midnight. None of these things were in his contract, but Dan had long since stopped doing things because he had to. Downstairs, Lily was reading under the desk lamp at reception, her feet tucked under her, her book tilted just so. Still at it, kiddo? June, the night shift receptionist, smiled as she walked past with a mug of tea. Lily looked up. I'm almost done. My dad says if I finish 3 books by Friday, he'll take me to the used bookstore. Nice deal. What's this one about? Lily beamed. A girl who builds a raft to find her mom, but she ends up building a boat that rescues a whole village instead. June grinned. That sounds like your dad. Lily tilted her head. What do you mean? June hesitated, then sat beside her. I mean, your dad, he builds things too. Just not the kind people see. Lily considered that, then nodded slowly. He builds better days. Later that night, Dan paused on the 34th floor, the executive wing. He always saved it for last, not because it was more important, but because it required a different kind of attention. Everything was glass, chrome, and spotless pride. As he pushed his cart down the main corridor, the elevator behind him chimed. Dan glanced back, surprised to see Evelyn Shaw step out, dressed in workout leggings and a light sweater. Her hair was tied back, no makeup, not the CEO, just a woman late, tired, holding a yoga mat. She didn't see him at first. Dan moved to the side, giving her space. Working late. Evelyn stopped, not startled, but uncertain. Needed the quiet, she said. Dan nodded. It's the best time for thinking. She glanced at him. You always work this quietly? He gave a half smile. The quiet's where things get done. Evelyn looked past him to the office kitchen. Is the tea cabinet still stocked? Top shelf. Green teas in the blue tin. She raised an eyebrow. You remember where things are that most of my managers don't. Dan simply shrugged. It's easier to fix what you respect. A pause. A thin smile flickered at the edge of her lips. Then she walked past and For first time in years, Evelyn Shaw said, "Have a good night, Mr. Mercer." Dan turned back to his car and replied, "You too, Miss Shaw." And when she disappeared into the office kitchen, he found himself smiling. Not because she knew his name, but because somehow it sounded like she'd meant it. When he and Lily walked out into the crisp night air hours later, Dan carried the day in his shoulders, not the weight, but the meaning. They passed a man asleep near the bus stop. Dan paused, opened his bag, and removed his extra sandwich, the one Lily hadn't eaten. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. Dan nodded, handing it to the man with a quiet, "Here you go." As they walked on, Lily looked up at him. Was he hungry? Maybe, Dan replied. Maybe he just needed to know someone saw him. They walked in silence for a while longer. Finally, Lily asked, "Do you think people notice when we help?" Dan looked at the sky, then down at his daughter. "Doesn't matter," he said. "We don't do it so they notice. We do it so they don't disappear." The sky above Shaw Financial was a dull pewter gray, the kind that pressed low over the city like a held breath. Inside the tower, everything moved with the same hollow efficiency as always. Key cards beeped. Heels clicked on tile. Meetings began exactly on the hour. But in Evelyn Shaw's corner office on the 34th floor, the usual rhythm was off. She stood at the window, arms crossed, coffee untouched, eyes watching the clouds roll over the skyline. She hadn't slept. Not really. Not since the sticky note. Not since the man, Daniel Mercer. She hadn't expected. The name stuck in her mind, steady, quiet, like the man himself. He hadn't tried to impress her. He hadn't even looked nervous. In fact, he'd spoken to her as if she weren't the CEO of one of the most powerful financial firms in the state, like she was just a person. That unsettled Evelyn Shaw more than any boardroom ambush. Her intercom buzzed. "Miss Shaw, you're 8:30 with legal." She snapped back to reality. "Push it to 9. A pause. "Yes, ma'am." She turned away from the glass, jaw tight. Something was off, and she didn't know what. She didn't like not knowing. By noon, she dismissed 2 meetings early and skipped lunch entirely. Her assistant, Mia, had tried to intervene with a gentle suggestion of soup, which earned only a tight-lipped later. But Evelyn didn't eat later. She barely drank her coffee. Instead, she found herself, almost unconsciously, opening the HR employee portal. She keyed in Mercer Daniel. Basic file. Address listed as a modest complex in East Ridge, one of the city's older neighborhoods. No emergency contact. Previous employment blank. Hired 3 months ago. No incidents. Blank file. Full presence. She leaned back, eyes narrowing. People didn't just erase careers like his without a reason. By late afternoon, Evelyn caved. She didn't like the feeling, but she was too deep in the question now. She texted a number she hadn't used in months. "I need a favor. You still know people at Altus Automotive?" The reply came 10 minutes later. "Contact always. Want me to dig on Dan Mercer?" Yes." Quietly. Then, as if on cue, the sky opened and steady rain began to fall. Evelyn, flawless, composed, guarded, shut her office door, sat at her desk, and for reasons she couldn't explain, felt her throat tighten. After hours, the executive gym was empty. Evelyn changed into running gear, pulled her hair into a low ponytail, and entered the treadmill room with the energy of a woman trying to outrun her own restlessness. She set the incline to 10 and began to run. The first few minutes were mechanical, but then, like a dam cracking, images flooded in, not of meetings or earnings reports, but of her father, powerful, charming, telling her, "The world is transactional. Love is just leverage with a ribbon on it." She remembered how he'd smiled when people praised his humble beginnings as a janitor, never admitting how he stepped over others to climb out. She remembered the day she learned he'd stolen from a family that first gave him a job. "Everyone has a cost," he'd told her. "Your job is to figure out what it is before they figure out yours." That was the day she stopped trusting kindness. The day she stopped trusting anyone. And yet here was this janitor, a man who handed out hope like folded paper notes. She couldn't stop thinking about him. Couldn't stop wondering why he hadn't tried to climb, why he was still there in the background, fixing what others ignored. The treadmill beeped. 10 miles she hadn't noticed. She stepped off, breath unsteady. And for the first time in over a year, Evelyn Shaw cried. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to feel real again. Meanwhile, Dan was repairing a jam printer on the 18th floor. His hands moved quickly, practiced, wiping toner smudges with a cloth from his cart. The office was dark, empty, lit only by the pale blue of the machine screen. Once done, he left a note for the morning staff. All clear now. Sometimes machines just need a little grace. D. He exited quietly, heading toward the elevator. But on the way, he paused at the open door of the gym. A light was on. Someone was sitting on the edge of the treadmill. It was her, Evelyn. She didn't see him. She was hunched forward, towel clutched in both hands, eyes glazed over, lost. Dan stood still, uncertain. Then Lily's words echoed from a few nights before. I think people forget what it feels like to be helped. He took a breath, stepped back silently, and disappeared down the corridor, leaving her that moment of solitude untouched. Some people didn't need words. Some just needed space to feel again. Later that night, Dan and Lily walked home under the tail end of the rain. The umbrella barely covered both of them, but neither complained. Did anyone say thank you today? Lily asked, looking up. Dan chuckled. Nope. Do you mind? He shook his head. I don't help people so they'll notice, Button. I help because someone once helped me when I didn't know how to ask. Was it Mom? Lily asked softly. Dan's step slowed. She was the first. Yeah. Lily smiled. Then I'll help people, too. Dan looked down at her, eyes warm. You already do. As they turned onto their street, Dan felt something lift. He didn't know that far above them, in a tower of glass and steel, a woman was standing at her own window, watching the city lights blink to life, and wondering for the first time in a long, long time if maybe, just maybe, some things were worth believing in again. The storm rolled in fast, dark clouds blotting out what was left of the morning sun, as thunder rumbled low above the city. Inside Shaw Financial, the tension was no less electric. Dan sensed at the moment he stepped through the lobby that evening. People moved faster than usual. Conversations stopped when elevators chimed. Even June, the normally cheerful receptionist, offered only a tight smile as Lily settled into her usual corner with her book. Something's up, she whispered as Dan passed. Big deal went south this morning. People are jittery. Dan nodded, didn't press. He'd learned long ago that the higher the tower, the easier it was to feel when the structure shook. By the time he reached the 34th floor, the atmosphere had turned frigid. Desks were deserted. Papers left mid-shuffle. Coffee mugs half full and forgotten. The glow of the overhead lights only made the emptiness feel sharper, like the aftermath of something broken. Then the voice came through his earpiece. Dan Mercer, please report to Office 34B immediately. The voice was clipped. Not Evelyn's. Someone else. Dan frowned but complied. Inside Office 34B, 3 people sat waiting. 2 men in suits and a woman he didn't recognize. Their expressions were tight, formal. Mr. Mercer. One began, we have a situation. Dan stayed standing. There was a systems failure this morning around 4:15 a.m. Main server controls were compromised. Emergency lights triggered. Security systems shut down. As a result, a critical investment call with Tokyo was interrupted. The deal collapsed. Dan folded his arms slowly, and the woman slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a printout of security logs. You're the only employee who accessed a maintenance closet tied to the 34th floor power relay within an hour of the failure. Dan's jaw clenched, because the emergency light in the hallway kept flickering. I fixed it. The wiring had a short. I rerouted it. You're not certified to handle electrical panels. I didn't touch the panel, Dan replied evenly. I replaced a faulty switch. That hallway's been buzzing for weeks. The second man looked unimpressed. Regardless, we're placing you on immediate suspension while we investigate. Turn in your badge before you leave tonight. There was no room for protest. No Evelyn, no questions, just silence. Dan left the room without a word. Back in the lobby, Lily looked up from her book, smiling until she saw his face. "Daddy," she asked, her voice small. Dan knelt in front of her, hands on her shoulders. "We're going home early tonight, sweetheart." "Why?" He tried to smile. It didn't reach his eyes. They just need some time to figure something out. Nothing to worry about. But even Lily, bright, innocent Lily, could see the storm in his eyes. Evelyn returned from her late meeting with the board, shoulders sore, head pounding, patience thin. The Tokyo fallout had been brutal. Millions lost, her credibility questioned. She walked past Office 34B when she heard a voice. "Fire the janitor. Mercer, we don't need liabilities right now." She froze. Her eyes narrowed. She stepped back. "What did you just say?" Evelyn's voice sliced through the corridor like ice. The men in the office turned, startled. The younger one stammered. He was the only one with access near the... He's not an electrician. "No, but the logs. I read the logs," Evelyn snapped. "If you actually paid attention, you'd see the timestamps show he was logged out 10 minutes before the system crashed. Did either of you check the backup relay room or the IT admin logs?" Silence. "You just made a decision without full information and dismissed one of the few employees in this building who actually fixes things without being asked." The men exchanged nervous glances. "We didn't realize." "No," she said coldly. "You didn't." She turned and strode down the hall. That night, she couldn't sleep. She found herself sitting on the edge of her bed barefoot, hair down, replaying every interaction she'd had with Dan since he arrived. The note, the quiet, the steadiness, the fact that he never once sought her attention, and yet had become impossible to ignore. Her phone buzzed. A message from the contact she'd texted earlier in the week. Altus confirmed Mercer was their top systems engineer. Designed a modular fail-safe power system. Left after his wife's death. Turned down multiple offers after that. Went dark. Evelyn stared at the screen. Top systems engineer and now cleaning floors. She didn't know whether to feel ashamed or furious at the company, at the men in that office, or at herself. Then she looked down at the floor, beside her bed. Lying there was a book, the same title she'd seen Lily reading days ago. She picked it up, fingers tracing the cover. The Girl Who Built a Boat. She opened it, and a note fluttered out. A sticky note. Familiar handwriting. "Don't give up on people. Not even yourself. D." Her throat tightened. She stood. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, Dan sat at the cracked kitchen table of their small apartment, sipping black coffee, trying to. Dan smiled for Lily as she packed her school bag. He'd already called the school bus, canceled his shift, and run the numbers in his head, wondering how many weeks he had left before the bills would become too much. A knock came at the door. He opened it to find Evelyn Shaw standing in his hallway, jeans and a sweatshirt replacing her usual suit, a manila folder in her hand. He blinked. "Ms. Shaw." "Evelyn," she corrected. "I came to apologize." Dan stared, unreadable. She offered the folder. "Your suspension is lifted. Full reinstatement and a formal apology from the board." He didn't take it yet. "I didn't ask for that." "I know," she said, "but you deserve it." A beat passed. Then Lily appeared behind him. Curious. "Hi, Lily," Evelyn said softly. "I hear you're a very fast reader." Lily grinned. "Daddy says books make the hard days quieter." Evelyn's voice caught. "He's right." Dan looked at her, not as a CEO, but as a woman who, for once, had chosen to show up. "I'll come back tonight," he said. "No," Evelyn replied gently. "Come back as someone more than a janitor. I have a new role for you, one we'll talk about when you're ready." Dan said nothing, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes, and for the first time since his world had broken, something in him began to mend. The elevator glided to a stop at the 34th floor with its usual whisper of finality. Evelyn stepped out alone, a to-go cup of untouched coffee in one hand, her phone in the other. The hallway was dim in the early morning light, the office still empty, the city outside just waking up. She paused outside her door, then almost without thinking, turned and walked past it straight to the small break room tucked between finance and legal. It was quiet, the kind of space meant for conversation, but rarely used for more than microwaving leftovers. She sat at the corner table and stared at nothing. For 10 minutes, she didn't move, just sat. It had been a long time since Evelyn Shaw thought about her childhood. People assumed she was born into wealth, born with the boardroom in her blood. But the truth was different. She'd been born into foster care, bounced between homes until she was 6, when Charles Shaw, wealthy, eccentric, powerful, adopted her. It was a public gesture of charity, a story for the press. But behind the gates of the Shaw estate, Charles had his own ideas of raising a child. Strictness wasn't discipline, it was control. Mistakes weren't corrected. They were punished quietly with silence and withdrawal until she learned to earn love with perfection. Loyalty, he used to say, is the most valuable currency. She remembered being 8, standing in a hallway with a broken glass figurine at her feet. She hadn't touched it, but the housekeeper had insisted she had. Her father looked down at her and said, "Sometimes people will lie about you. What matters is how convincing they are." She took the blame. She always did. It made her strong, he said. Years later, when she learned he'd embezzled from his first employer, the family that had taken him in as a janitor and helped him rise, Evelyn confronted him. "You stole from the people who believed in you," she'd said. His reply, "Belief is cheap. Leverage is real." That was the moment she decided she would never depend on kindness again. Kindness was leverage in disguise, until Daniel Mercer, a man who asked for nothing, fixed what was broken, helped because he could, a man who, in his quiet way, had upended everything she thought she knew about goodness. And then there was Lily, the little girl who didn't look at Evelyn with fear or awe, but with curiosity, with trust. Evelyn blinked hard, then stood. She stepped out of the break room and made her way to the lobby. The morning crowd had begun to file in, suits and lanyards and caffeine-fueled ambition. June at the front desk greeted her with surprise. "Good morning, Miss Shaw. You're early. I need to ask you something," Evelyn said. "Of course. Dan Martier? You know him?" June smiled. Everyone knows Dan. He's the kind of guy who notices when your heel is wobbling and fixes your chair without asking. Evelyn nodded. "And his daughter Lily? Sweetest kid I've ever met. Reads everything. Last week, she offered to organize my snack drawer because she said it'd stress her out." Evelyn almost smiled. "Has he ever mentioned his wife?" June paused. "Once. She passed away. Cancer, I think. He doesn't talk about it unless someone needs to hear it." Evelyn tilted her head. "What do you mean?" June looked at her carefully. One night, one of the new custodians broke down crying. Her brother had just been diagnosed. Dan sat with her for over an hour. He didn't say much, just listened. And then quietly, he told her what it felt like to say goodbye to someone too soon. She paused. "He's the kind of man who doesn't give advice unless he's lived it." That silence returned. Evelyn thanked her and walked back to the elevator. Upstairs, she stood at her office window again, watching the morning traffic crawl through the city. But her thoughts weren't on numbers. They were on a small 2-bedroom apartment in East Ridge, on a man who mended things, and a little girl who looked at the world with open hands. What kind of man chooses to disappear after success? What kind of man walks away from patents and partnerships to sweep floors? One who's grieving? One who knows that sometimes being seen isn't as important as being there. Later that afternoon, Evelyn found herself alone in the executive garage. The vintage car sat in the far corner, covered in dust, a 1967 Mustang Fastback, her father's, or rather hers now. She kept out a sentiment, though it hadn't started in over 3 years. She stared at it for a long while. Then, on impulse, she pulled the cover off. The paint had dulled. The tires sagged. The hood sat crooked. It was a relic of another life, of memories, both warm and cruel. Then softly, a voice behind her. "Didn't expect to see you down here." She turned. Dan stood near the entrance in uniform, pushing his cart past the storage lockers. He paused when he saw the car. "Is that a 67 Fastback?" She nodded. "It was my father's." Dan stepped closer respectfully. She's a beauty. Haven't seen one of these in a long time. She hasn't run since he died, Evelyn said. Dan looked at her, not intruding, just listening. I thought about selling her a few times, she added, but I never could. Dan crouched beside the hood, ran a hand along the edge. She's not gone, he said softly, just waiting for someone to care enough to fix her. Their eyes met. Not a word was said. Not a single piece of strategy or defense or leverage passed between them. Just two people passing in one moment of understanding. That evening, Lily looked up from her book as Dan drove them home. Did anything interesting happen at work today? She asked. Dan hesitated, then smiled faintly. I saw someone remember who they used to be. Lily tilted her head. Is that a good thing? Dan looked out at the city lights, flickering on like stars returning to sky. I think, he said, it might be the best thing. The morning started like any other at Shaw Financial. Emails stacked in inboxes before the coffee cooled. Interns triple-checking PowerPoints. And Evelyn Shaw already at her desk before the city's first light had touched the windows. But something had shifted. She wasn't skimming quarterly reports or briefing her analysts. She was rereading a resume that should never have landed on her desk. The folder had been placed in her inbox by mistake or providence. Inside was a half-printed file labeled Daniel Mercer, a background skills assessment that someone from HR had likely intended to file away or delete, but it hadn't been deleted. And now Evelyn sat, her brow furrowed, as she turned the page. Evelyn's brow furrowed as she scanned the lines that contradicted everything she thought she knew. 10 years at Altus Automotive, lead engineer on modular engine designs, 2 registered patents, recognized for energy efficiency innovation, left post 7 years ago. No forwarding employer. She leaned back in her chair, stunned. The resume wasn't just impressive, it was extraordinary. The kind of background that should have placed Dan in high-level consultancy or, at the very least, a senior technical role in Silicon Valley, not pushing a janitor's cart down the hallway of her building. Her first instinct was disbelief. Surely this had to be someone else. But the address matched. The handwriting on the resume, where Dan had scrawled, references available upon request, matched the note he'd once left in the conference room. It was him, a man who had chosen to vanish from the professional world. But why? Evelyn stood abruptly. She needed answers, and not the kind filtered through HR files. By late morning, she found herself taking an uncharacteristic detour to the maintenance level. The break room for night staff was quiet, the scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air. A single figure sat by the window, sketching something on a pad of paper beside a styrofoam cup Dan. He looked up, surprised but not unsettled. Didn't expect to see you down here, he said calmly. I could say the same, Evelyn replied. She hesitated, then stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. I read your resume. Dan didn't flinch. He set his pencil down and met her gaze. I figured you might eventually. Why didn't you tell anyone? She asked. You could have had any job here, Randy, infrastructure, hell, CTO if you wanted it. Why this? Dan leaned back, folding his hands. His expression wasn't offensive, but measured. When my wife was diagnosed, I stepped away from Altus. We had a daughter, and I didn't want to spend my time in boardrooms or flying cross-country for contracts. I wanted to be there. Evelyn's voice softened. You could have returned after. Dan looked at his hands. I tried, but nothing felt right. The world I knew had moved on, and I didn't want to chase it. I wanted something quiet, something honest, where I could see the difference I was making every day. He glanced at her, fixing what's broken without anyone asking me to. That's enough for me. She nodded slowly, absorbing his words like a language she hadn't spoken in years. It's more than enough, she said quietly, but it's also a waste. Dan tilted his head. I don't mean that unkindly, she added. But I look around this building and see people with polished resumes and half your integrity, half your grit, and they're being promoted just because they know how to talk during meetings. Dan smiled faintly. I'm not great at meetings. You're great at people, she said. That's rarer. There was a silence then, not awkward, deep. Something unsaid passed between them. Finally, Evelyn stood. I'd like to offer you a different role here. One that uses more what you know and still lets you be home in time for Lily. Dan looked at her carefully. Why? She blinked. What do you mean? You don't strike me as someone who offers positions out of sentiment. She gave a soft laugh. You're right. I don't. She paused and added, but I do recognize when someone makes this place better just by showing up. Dan nodded once, slowly. I'll think about it. Take your time, she said. Then, almost as an afterthought, she looked down at the paper he'd been sketching on. It was a rough design of a heating system modification, neat, efficient, and elegant. Evelyn gave him one last look, then turned and walked out, her heart unsettled in a way she hadn't expected. That night, Dan walked Lily home under a sky glowing with the orange haze of the setting sun. She held his hand with one and clutched a new book in the other. Daddy. Yeah, Button? Are you ever going to go back to building stuff again? Dan looked down at her, surprised. Where'd that come from? I don't know, she said. Sometimes when you talk to people, your eyes look like they remember things your mouth doesn't. He chuckled. That's a pretty big thought for someone under 5 feet tall. She grinned. Books make me taller. Dan paused as they reached their apartment building. I don't know if I'll build again, he said honestly, but I might try. She smiled and skipped ahead. And in that quiet moment, watching his daughter leap toward the front steps like they were the edge of the moon, Dan felt something inside him stir. Not regret, not longing, hope. Back at Shaw Financial, Evelyn stood at the garage looking at her father's old car again. The Mustang's paint was still dull, the tires still low, but something had shifted. It no longer looked like a relic of the past. It looked like a project worth saving, just like someone else she'd underestimated. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to Dan Mercer. I'll have the keys to the Mustang on my desk tomorrow, in case you want to start building again. She stared at it for a long moment, then hit send, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't brace for disappointment. She just waited. It was nearly midnight when Evelyn Shaw stood alone in her office, the city lights sprawling beneath her like a galaxy pinned to glass. The building had emptied hours ago, but she hadn't left. Couldn't. Something inside her had shifted, and she wasn't sure where it would land. On her desk sat a simple keyring, 2 worn keys, one smaller than the other, tagged with a note that read, Garage, Mustang, just in case. She turned them over in her palm as if they weighed more than steel. Dan hadn't replied to her message. Not yet, but she didn't expect he would, not with words. 3 blocks away in a modest apartment, tucked between a closed diner and a shuttered laundromat, Dan sat at the kitchen table, the low hum of the fridge the only sound in the room. Lily had long since fallen asleep, curled up beneath a stack of books and a pink blanket on the sofa. Dan stared at the email on his screen, the one confirming his reinstatement, and then the second email from Evelyn herself. Subject: Let's build something different. I meant what I said. This company needs more than ambition. It needs backbone. You have it. If you're willing, I'd like to put you in charge of internal systems reform. Flexible hours, autonomy, full benefits, no title games. You can say no, but I hope you won't. Dan sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He hadn't been offered something like this since before the world cracked open beneath his feet. When Claire was diagnosed, everything stopped. They fought the good fight for 2 years, chemo travel, hope, heartbreak. In the end, she died on a Tuesday morning holding his hand, whispering, "Don't disappear." He had tried not to, but grief doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like silence, like turning down calls, like moving to a city where no one knows you used to be someone important. He'd taken the janitor job because it was simple, quiet, and because Lily needed stability more than she needed a legacy. But now something new was stirring. Not ambition, purpose. The next morning, Dan walked into the Shaw Financial garage just after sunrise, the Mustang keys in hand. Evelyn was already there, hair tied back, sleeves rolled, eyes soft. The car sat where it always had, dust covered and forgotten. Dan walked around it once, then opened the hood. He took a long breath and smiled faintly. She's worth saving, he said. "I thought you might say that." Evelyn stood beside him, watching. "My father used to drive me to school in this car," she said, "before things got complicated." Dan looked up. "You loved him?" Evelyn hesitated. "I think I loved the version of him I imagined. The one who rescued me when I was 6. The one who bought me my first telescope and told me I could outwork any man in the room." She paused. "Then I learned what he'd done to others, to himself, and I realized even broken people can wear halos if you catch them in the right light." Dan gently lowered the hood. "We're all a mix of light and rust," he said. "Doesn't mean we're beyond repair." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Understanding, recognition. Later that day, Evelyn stood at the front of staff meeting, a rare full-floor gathering pulled together at her request. Department heads buzzed with curiosity. She tapped the mic once, cleared her throat. "I'm introducing a new initiative starting this quarter," she said. "We're building a systems optimization team, cross-departmental, non-traditional." People murmured. "Heading it up is someone who, until recently, most of you knew only as our night janitor." Dead silence. Dan stepped into the room dressed in a clean button-down, not a uniform. No mop, no gloves, just quiet confidence. "This is Daniel Mercer," Evelyn said. "What most of you don't know is that he's the engineer behind several of the systems we rely on daily. He chose a quieter path for reasons that are ours to share or not, but his integrity, problem-solving, and empathy have already changed the fabric of this building more than any white paper ever has." A long pause and applause. It began hesitantly, then grew. Dan nodded once, humbled. "Thank you. I'm not here to fix the company, just to fix what needs fixing." The room smiled. That was enough. That night, as Dan walked out of the building with Lily skipping beside him, Evelyn caught up to them near the sidewalk. "Did it feel strange?" she asked. Dan shrugged. "Felt like stepping into old shoes. Ones I've forgotten still fit." Lily looked up at Evelyn. "Daddy fixed the car today." "Did he?" Evelyn smiled. "Well, he cleaned out the leaves and found a raccoon's old sandwich in the engine. I think that's a win." Evelyn laughed, an easy, full laugh, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in years. "You're both invited to lunch on Sunday," she said impulsively. "No work talk, just real food." Dan raised a brow. "That's not in the contract." "No," she said, "but neither is changing someone's life. And you did that anyway." He smiled. "I'll bring dessert." As they parted ways, Evelyn watched them disappear down the block, father and daughter silhouettes against the setting sun. And for the first time in her adult life, she realized healing doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it shows up quietly, holding a wrench, carrying a backpack, and leaving behind a kind of warmth that lingers long after the lights go out. The change was subtle at first, barely noticeable if you didn't already know where to look. But for those who paid attention, the pulse of Shaw Financial had shifted. Morning greetings lingered a second longer. The air in the break room wasn't quite so tense. Even the elevator rides, once rigid with silence, now carried occasional laughter or a shared nod of recognition. And at the center of it, quietly, almost invisibly, was Dan Mercer. Gone were the janitor's gloves and midnight mop shifts. Dan now wore an open collar shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a tablet tucked under one arm, as he moved through the building with calm, purposeful energy. His new title, Director of Internal Systems Reform, didn't appear on the office door, mostly because he didn't ask for one. He still fixed the flickering hallway lights himself. Still noticed when the front desk printer needed toner. Still brought coffee to the new IT guy when no one remembered his name. It was how he rebuilt trust, not with speeches or grand strategies, but with small, intentional acts over and over again. Evelyn watched him from her office window more often than she cared to admit. He had quickly built a small team, cross-functional, efficient, loyal, not to the title, but to the man. Dan never micromanaged, but he knew everything happening in his sphere. People who'd once been overlooked were now thriving. Rosa from accounting, whose ideas had been ignored for years. Malik, a single father from facilities who now ran the logistics arm of Dan's project group. Dan didn't demand excellence. He invited it, and people followed because they felt seen, respected, valued. Evelyn stood in the hallway one afternoon, watching through the glass as Dan whiteboarded with 3 team members and a junior analyst. They were laughing about something, and when the analyst made a mistake, Dan didn't correct her. He guided her to see it herself, then praised the fix. The girl's posture shifted, shoulders back, chin up. Evelyn felt something twist in her chest. A memory. She was 11, standing in her father's home office, knees shaking, heart in her throat. She stayed up all night, finishing a science project, handwritten notes, diagrams, predictions about the planets. She handed it to him, breathless. He flipped through it once, set it aside. Next time, he said coldly, type it. She remembered the way her small hands crumpled the edge of the page. She never showed him anything again. The knock on her door broke the memory. Dan entered, holding a file. Got a minute? Evelyn nodded, gesturing to the chair across from her. Always. He handed her the report. Update on system restructuring. 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Savings are projected to exceed Q4 targets. She scanned the pages, impressed but not surprised. You've done more in 2 months than most execs do in 2 years. Dan smiled. Evelyn glanced at him, something unspoken flickering in her eyes. And yet you still sweep the mailroom when the bin overflows. Dan chuckled. Old habits. I don't like stepping over things that need attention. A pause settled between them. Then Evelyn asked softly, how do you do it? Dan tilted his head. Do what? Build trust without asking for it, without controlling it. He leaned forward slightly. Because trust isn't earned by being perfect. It's earned by being consistent, by showing up again and again, especially when no one's looking. Evelyn didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her hands, those same hands that had once clutched a telescope, a notebook, and an invisible shield. I wasn't always like this, she said. I used to believe in people, in second chances. Dan waited, listening. My father taught me that vulnerability is weakness, that if I trusted anyone, they'd use it against me. And for a long time, I believed him. She looked up. But you don't operate like that. Dan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, you don't have to believe the people who hurt you were right just because they were first. Her breath caught. He stood, gently closing the folder. You built something incredible here, Evelyn, but it doesn't have to be lonely at the top. And with that, he left her office. No performance, no pressure, just presence. That evening, Evelyn stayed late, not because of deadlines, but because she couldn't stop thinking about Dan, about Lily, about herself. She walked the garage where the Mustang now sat, hood up, engine half restored. Tools were lying neatly on a rolling cart beside it. The car wasn't ready yet, but it was coming back to life. Like her, she ran her fingers along the hood, then opened the glove box. Inside was a new sticky note. Some things take time, but they are worth saving. D. Her eyes burned. She sat behind the wheel, closed her eyes, and let the silence settle around her. Not like a prison this time, but a cocoon. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was alone in it. Outside, in a small booth just off Main Street, Dan and Lily were sharing burgers under yellowed string lights. Did Miss Shaw say yes to lunch? Lily asked between bites. She didn't say no, Dan replied with a smile. Lily nodded wisely. She's still learning how to say yes. Dan raised his root beer in a toast. To learning. Lily clinked her soda against his. And somewhere across town, Evelyn sat behind the wheel of her father's car, looking at the city lights through a windshield she could finally see through. It was a Tuesday morning, bright and brisk, the kind of autumn day that made the city feel alive. Crisp air, golden leaves swirling near sidewalks, steam rising from every coffee cup at Shaw Financial. The building buzzed with a different kind of energy. Today was the quarterly emergency preparedness drill. By 9 a.m., employees were already grumbling over memos, evacuations, floor leaders, head counts. Evelyn Shaw stood in the command center with the head of security, arms crossed, eyes focused on the digital board tracking the building's 35 floors. Let's keep it clean, keep it sharp, she instructed. No chaos, no shortcuts. Every department clears by protocol. Yes, ma'am. She didn't enjoy these drills, but she respected them. Systems didn't fall apart from major failures. They crumbled when people got comfortable. She wasn't about to let that happen. Dan took a deep breath as he checked his team's comms one last time. Even now, wearing his button-down and company badge, he carried the emergency clipboard like he had when he was still wearing gloves and pushing carts. Old habits. All right, he said to Rosa, Malik, and 3 junior staff from HR when the alarm sounds. Everyone out to the east stairwell. I'll sweep the west. You always volunteer for the basement floors, Rosa noted. Dan shrugged. Someone has to. They're always last clear. At precisely 9:30 a.m., the first alarm blared. Strobes blinked. A calm but firm voice echoed to the intercom. Emergency drill in progress. Please evacuate using nearest stairwell. The hallways filled quickly but orderly, thanks to preparation. Dan jogged down the back stairwell to sublevel 2, parking and maintenance. He moved fast. Boiler room clear. Janitorial supply clear. Server substation. He stopped. Through the small wired window in the server room door, he saw movement. A figure alone. He pushed the door open. Inside, a young woman no older than 22 was crouched near a cabinet, clearly flustered. Dan recognized her. Emma, the intern who had just transferred from records. She was pale, eyes wide, holding her phone with trembling fingers. Emma, Dan said calmly. It's okay. Drill's almost over. Come on, let's get upstairs. I can't, she whispered. My leg cramped. I was trying to get the old archive box from Miss Geller, and the alarm went off. I panicked. Dan stepped closer, crouched beside her. Let me help. She hesitated, then nodded. He guided her gently to her feet, wrapped one arm under her shoulders, and together they limped toward the exit. Then the lights flickered. A second later, darkness, and then smoke, real, not from the drill. Dan turned. A faint hiss came from the far utility wall. The smell, plastic, electrical, sharp. Something had shorted. Not part of the plan. Dan's instincts kicked in. He tapped his emergency radio. Command! This is Mercer on Sub 2. We've got a real issue. Smoke in the server room. Possible electrical fire. Evacuating now with 1 injured. Copy, came the immediate response. Sending emergency response to your location. Dan turned to Emma. We're going to get out. Deep breath. She nodded, eyes wet but steady. They moved fast, Dan half carrying her through the corridor. Smoke now thickening. The flicker of flames barely visible near the far cabinet. Dan didn't slow down. Not for a second. Meanwhile, on the 34th floor, Evelyn was staring at the emergency board. 1 red light flashed in Sub 2. Who's down there? She barked. Just Mercer and a junior intern. According to check-in logs, a technician answered. Evelyn's hands clenched. Has fire control been dispatched? They're en route. The second she saw Dan's signal reappear on the board, moving toward the stairwell, she exhaled, but only slightly. By the time Dan reached the sublevel exit, Emma's breathing had evened out. Her leg was still shaky, but she was walking on her own. The moment they stepped through the stairwell door, a team from building safety intercepted them with oxygen masks and fire blankets. Dan waved them toward Emma. She's priority. I'm fine. They insisted on checking him anyway. Minor smoke inhalation. No burns. He declined the ambulance. I've had worse cooking pancakes, he muttered, and one of the safety officers laughed. 10 minutes later, as the fire was confirmed extinguished and the building declared safe, Evelyn descended to Sub 2 herself. She found Dan sitting against the stairwell wall, sipping from a water bottle. Their eyes met, and for a beat, neither spoke. Then Evelyn knelt in front of him. I saw the report. They said you carried her half the way out. She did most of the work, Dan said quietly. She just needed someone to walk with. Evelyn swallowed, her voice low. You didn't have to go back. I did, he said simply. Why? Evelyn met his gaze. Because I know what it feels like to be in a place where you think no one's coming for you. Her throat tightened. You always show up, she said. Dan nodded. That's the job. No, she said, voice breaking slightly. That's who you are. And then, before she could stop herself, Evelyn reached forward and touched his hand. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't a declaration. It was something deeper, a bridge, a moment of quiet between two people who had lived long in silence. That evening, Lily wrapped her arms around her dad like she was anchoring him to the earth. "You were really in a fire?" she whispered. "Just a little smoke and heat," Dan said. "The real heat came from the cafeteria chili." She giggled despite herself. "Did you save someone?" Dan kissed the top of her head. "I just didn't leave her behind." Lily pulled back, serious now. "You'd never leave anyone behind." Dan smiled and thought of Claire and Evelyn, and a building full of people who for once felt a little more human, because someone remembered they were worth saving. At the Mustang that night, Evelyn found something tucked under the windshield wiper. A single sticky note. "It's not about fixing everything. It's about showing up when it counts." She closed her eyes and let herself feel the weight of being seen. The morning sun spilled golden light across the lobby of Shaw Financial as Lily skipped in beside her father, clutching a small paper bag tied with blue ribbon. Her 9th birthday had arrived quietly. No balloons, no fuss, just a morning hug, a homemade pancake, and Dan's promise that they'd go book hunting that weekend. To Lily, that was enough. She held Dan's hand a little tighter as they entered the building, whispering, "You don't have to tell anyone, okay? I don't want people making a big deal." Dan grinned. "Your secret's safe. But I'm still sneaking in your favorite sandwich for lunch and a cookie." He leaned down conspiratorially, one with extra chocolate chips. Lily beamed. What neither of them knew was that somewhere on the 34th floor, Evelyn Shaw had already put her day on pause. It had been a week since the fire drill, and though the building had returned to business as usual, something in Evelyn hadn't. The image of Dan helping that in turn, his calm voice through the smoke, his refusal to leave someone behind, it lingered. It haunted her in the best way. She'd stayed late every night since, sitting behind her desk, watching the slow rebirth of trust, not just in Dan, but in herself. People had begun to approach her with ideas again, with vulnerability. Somehow, Dan's presence had softened the edges of the entire company. But it wasn't until she passed the front desk that morning that she learned something else. June, the receptionist, was pinning a doodled card onto her corkboard, a small square drawing of a girl and her dad with the caption, "Today is our special day." "Who drew that?" Evelyn asked. June smiled. "Lily, it's her birthday today. She didn't want a party. Just want to spend the day reading in the corner and maybe get a sandwich from her dad." Evelyn stood still for a moment, then turned and walked away without another word. By noon, the transformation of the rooftop garden was complete. It had taken 4 hours, a lot of favors, and one emergency delivery from a local bakery, but the small, overgrown space had been swept, trimmed, and covered in string lights. A modest picnic table sat at the center beneath a gently swaying canopy, surrounded by potted lavender and blooming wildflowers Evelyn had ordered weeks earlier for a different project. Now they serve a better purpose. At 12:15, Dan received a call on his cell, an unknown extension. "Mr. Mercer," came Evelyn's voice. "Yes." "Bring Lily to the rooftop. Use the west stairwell." He frowned. "What's this about?" But she'd already hung up. Dan turned to Lily, who was halfway through a chapter of her newest library find. "Birthday field trip," he said. Lily squinted. "Where?" "You'll see." The moment they stepped onto the rooftop, Lily gasped. A string of paper lanterns swayed above the table. A modest chocolate cake with rainbow sprinkles sat in the center next to 2 wrapped books and a small vase of wildflowers. Evelyn stood beside the table, a bit awkward in jeans and a soft blue blouse, far from her usual sharp-shouldered armor. Lily looked up at her dad, stunned. "Is this for me?" Dan turned to Evelyn. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," she said simply. She turned to Lily. "Happy birthday, Lily. I read somewhere that the best gifts don't come in boxes, but I cheated a little." She handed Lily the 2 books, one classic, one a newly released fantasy adventure. Lily hugged them to her chest like they were gold. Dan's voice was low. "You didn't have to go to this trouble. Evelyn met his eyes. You show up for everyone else. Dan. Let someone show up for you. That silence passed between them again, deep, comfortable. Then Lily tugged at Dan's sleeve. Can we sit? They did. Under the sky, surrounded by green and soft music Evelyn had playing from a speaker hidden behind a planter. They ate sandwiches, talked about books. Evelyn admitted to being a terrible baker, and even worse at remembering childhood birthdays. Lily, between bites of cake, grinned. That's okay. This one's already the best. Dan smiled, watching his daughter laugh, cheeks full of frosting, eyes shining. He looked at Evelyn and for the first time allowed himself to ask a question that had been building for weeks. Why did you do all this? Evelyn looked down for a moment, then met his eyes. Because she reminded me what I forgot, she said. What it means to care for someone without needing a reason. Dan didn't reply. He just nodded, and in that quiet understanding, something fragile passed between them, like a spark leaping across a narrow gap, lighting something that had long gone cold. Later that evening, back at home, Lily was curled up on the couch, rereading one of her new books. Dan stood by the window, watching the sky darken over the rooftops. She looked up. Do you think Miss Shaw's lonely? Dan turned. Why do you ask? She didn't talk much about her family. Dan sat beside her. Some people forget how to talk about the things that hurt. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then, can we invite her to Thanksgiving? Dan smiled. Let's see how she feels about birthday cake before we spring turkey on her. At Shaw Financial, Evelyn sat in the rooftop garden long after the Mercers had left. The table was cleared, the music gone silent, but she remained. Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and drew out a folded note Lily had left behind on the bench. In messy cursive, it read, "Thank you for seeing me. People don't always do that." Evelyn held it for a long moment, then tucked it carefully into her wallet between an old business card and a faded photo of her father. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was mourning her past. She felt like she was beginning something new, something that didn't need a title or a name, just a place at the table. The first snow of winter arrived softly, as if whispering an apology. It blanketed the city in a hush, settling on rooftops, sidewalks, and the wide stone steps of Shaw Financial. Inside the tower, the day was winding down. Employees bustled through the lobby, coats in hand, holiday plans on their lips. There was a warmth in the air, the kind that only December brings, the warmth of something drawing to a close, and something new just beginning. On the 34th floor, Evelyn stood at her office window, looking down at the streets below. She no longer wore her armor. The blazer had been exchanged for a knit sweater, the heels for soft boots. Her desk was less rigid now. Photos of her team on one side, a small potted plant from Lily near the corner. A picture frame held a child's drawing, a stick-figured girl, a tall man, and a woman with long hair standing beneath a string of lanterns. 3 smiling faces, labeled in careful handwriting. Us. A gentle knock tapped at the door. Dan stepped in, shaking snowflakes from his jacket, cheeks pink from the cold. Thought I'd catch you before you disappeared into another file, he said. Evelyn smiled. Caught me? He handed her a wrap box, plain brown paper, tied with twine. I thought we agreed. No gifts, she said, raising an eyebrow. Dan shrugged. We didn't shake on it. She opened it carefully. Inside was a small handmade wooden tray, refinished walnut, smooth and warm to the touch. In the center, a simple inscription, "Some things are worth rebuilding." Evelyn's throat tightened. She looked up. Thank you, she said softly. Dan hesitated, then pulled a folded envelope from his pocket. This is for you too, but it's more official. She took it curious. Inside was a finalized report. The Internal Systems Reform Project completed and fully implemented ahead of schedule. Attached was Dan's resignation letter. Evelyn blinked. You're leaving? He nodded slowly. Not going far. Just stepping out of the building. I've been offered a role at a community tech nonprofit downtown, fixing schools, training veterans. It's the kind of work Claire and I used to dream about doing together. He gave a small smile. It feels like the right time. Evelyn looked at him, something fragile flickering behind her eyes. And here I thought, I finally had someone on this floor I could trust. Dan stepped closer, voice gentle. You still do. I'm not vanishing, Evelyn. I'm just walking a little wider path. He paused and added, but I'd still like to have coffee on Wednesdays and pancakes with Lily on Saturdays, if you're open to that kind of regular scheduling. She let out a quiet laugh. I think I could make room for that. A beat passed. Then Dan did something she didn't expect. He reached out and held her hand. No urgency, no tension, just presence. In that simple gesture, Evelyn felt something open inside her that had been locked away for years. Not romance, not yet, but the kind of love that grows from roots, not fireworks. Steady, patient, real. That weekend, Evelyn found herself at a kitchen table that wasn't hers. Lily sat across from her, explaining the rules of her favorite board game with the intensity of a trial lawyer. Dan was flipping pancakes, humming a Sinatra tune off key. The apartment was modest, walls lined with second-hand books, mismatched mugs in the cabinet. But it was full of life, of belonging. Evelyn looked around the room and felt something she hadn't felt since childhood. Home. Later, as they sat on the floor watching an old Christmas movie, Lily fell asleep with her head in Evelyn's lap. Dan returned from the kitchen with 2 mugs of cocoa and stopped short when he saw them. Evelyn looked up, lips parted as if to explain, but he just smiled. I'll get a blanket, he said quietly. When he returned, he draped it over both of them, then sat beside Evelyn, shoulder to shoulder, their breaths slow and calm in the quiet of the evening. Outside, snow continued to fall, dusting the windows, softening the sharp lines of the city. And somewhere beneath those lights, a girl once forgotten had found her voice. A man once invisible had reclaimed his worth. And a woman once cold had remembered what it meant to feel. Not because of grand gestures, but because of kindness, because of presence, because one person showed up again and again when it mattered. Months later, a plaque appeared on the first floor of Shaw Financial, just outside the community lounge. It read, "The Mercer Room, dedicated to those who fix quietly, care deeply, and never ask for recognition." Employees passed it every day. Some paused, some smiled, but every single one remembered. Because legacies aren't always built in boardrooms. Sometimes they're built in broken stairwells, birthday gardens, and the sound of laughter shared over pancakes. And sometimes, family isn't what you're born into, it's what you build. We'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your city or country in the comments. We read everyone, and it means so much to see how far these stories reach. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel for more emotional and inspiring tales like this one. Your support helps us continue to share stories that matter. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care and be kind.